The gavel came down twice before anyone in that courtroom understood what the dog already knew. Nobody believed a scarred, one-eyed stray could save a room full of people from something no metal detector had caught. But by the time the sun set on Millhaven County that day, half the town would swear they'd seen a miracle wearing a torn collar. It started 3 weeks earlier, in a gravel lot behind a diner that smelled like bacon grease and diesel exhaust, where a man named Daniel Cole was living out of a 2003 Ford pickup with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that had been glowing amber for so long he'd stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing an old wound that's finally gone numb. Dan Cole had been a Marine for 11 years. Explosive ordnance disposal, 2 deployments to Helmand Province, one to a place whose name he still didn't say out loud even when he was alone, because saying it made the smell come back, cordite and scorched earth, and something underneath that he never let himself name. He'd walked toward things that other men ran from. That had been his job, and for a long time he'd been proud of it in the quiet way men like him were proud of things, which is to say he never talked about it and would have denied it if asked. He came home with a limp in his left leg from a fragment that never fully came out, a tremor in his right hand that showed up mostly at night, and paperwork. So much paperwork. A medical board that took 14 months to schedule a follow-up. A disability claim that got kicked back twice for a missing signature that wasn't his to give. A discharge characterization that should have read honorable and instead, because of a clerical error nobody in 3 different offices would take responsibility for, sat in some database as general under honorable conditions. A distinction so small on paper and so enormous in practice that it had cost him his VA home loan, his healthcare priority group, and eventually the apartment he'd been renting in Ohio when the rent went up $80 and his unemployment didn't. By the time he rolled into Millhaven, a town of about 4,000 people wedged between soybean fields and a state highway nobody used anymore, he'd been living out of the truck for 5 months. He kept a 5-gallon water jug behind the driver's seat, a folded wool blanket that still had a faded Marine Corps emblem stitched into the corner, and a green plastic tub of canned food he rationed like it was still ammunition. He showered at the truck stop off Route 9 for $6, ate day-old bread from the discount rack at the grocery store, and picked up cash work when he could find it, fence repair, engine work, anything that didn't require him to fill out a form asking about his employment gaps, because there was no way to explain those gaps that didn't sound like an accusation against a country he'd still have died for without hesitation. He told himself it was temporary. He'd been telling himself that for 5 months. The morning the dog found him, Dan was sitting on his tailgate at 5:40 a.m., drinking gas station coffee out of a dented steel mug, watching the mist come up off the drainage ditch behind the diner. His hand was doing the thing it did in the cold, a fine tremor he controlled by wrapping his fingers tight around the mug until his knuckles went white. He heard the dumpster lid creak before he saw anything, and his whole body went still in that old, automatic way, weight distributed, breathing slow, eyes moving before his head did. Old habits. The habits that had kept him alive in places that wanted him dead were the same habits that made it hard for him to sit in a crowded diner or fall asleep to a normal person's schedule. What came around the corner of the dumpster wasn't a threat. It was a shape so thin it barely cast a shadow, moving low and careful, favoring its back left leg. Dan set his coffee down without thinking and just watched. The dog was some kind of shepherd mix, maybe 70 pounds if it had been eating right, which it clearly hadn't been for a long time. Its coat was a dull, dirt-matted brown and black, patched with places where the fur had never grown back over old scar tissue, long pale lines that ran across its ribs like something had raked it open once and it had healed wrong. One eye was a clouded, milky blue, blind, Dan guessed, from old trauma rather than birth, because the good eye was a sharp amber that tracked him with a wariness that had nothing feral in it. This wasn't a wild animal. This was an animal that had once trusted people and had very good reasons not to anymore. It stopped 8 feet away and looked at him the way Dan imagined he probably looked at strangers now, waiting to see what kind of hurt was coming. "I got nothing for you," Dan said, low, more out of reflex than expectation the dog would understand him. "Trust me, you're barking up the wrong truck." The dog didn't bark, it didn't move. Either it just sat down, slow and stiff, like sitting cost something, and kept that one good eye fixed on him. Dan finished his coffee in silence, aware the whole time of the dog watching, and when he climbed into the cab to head to the scrapyard where he had 3 hours of cash work lined up, he caught himself glancing in the side mirror. The dog hadn't moved. It just sat there in the gravel, watching the truck go, the way something sits and watches when it has learned that everything good eventually leaves. He told himself he wouldn't think about it. He thought about it the whole drive. That evening, he came back to the same lot out of habit. It was quiet. The diner owner didn't run him off as long as he kept the area clean, and there was a spigot around back he could use to rinse out his water jug. The dog was there again, in almost the same spot, and this time it didn't retreat when the truck pulled in. It watched him climb out, watched him crouch by the spigot, and when Dan turned around, holding half a ham sandwich he'd been planning to eat himself, the dog had crept 3 feet closer without seeming to have moved at all. "This is a mistake," Dan told it, tearing the sandwich in half and setting his portion on the gravel a few feet away, well outside arm's reach, because he knew enough about dogs like this, the wary kind, the kind with old damage in their eyes, not to crowd them. "I want you to understand that going in. I can barely feed myself." The dog didn't move for a long minute. Then it crept forward on its belly, the way dogs do when every part of their body is asking permission at once, and took the bread in careful bites, chewing like it hurt, like something in its jaw had been broken once and set badly. Dan watched it eat and felt something in his chest tight that he didn't have a name for and didn't want one. "Don't get used to this," he said. The dog looked up at him with its one good eye, chewed the last bite, and lay down in the gravel 11 feet away, close enough to watch him, far enough to run. It took 6 days before the dog would eat from his hand. It took 11 before it would let him touch the ridge of its shoulder. It took 19 before it climbed, uninvited, into the passenger footwell of his truck during a thunderstorm and refused to leave, shaking so hard its whole body blurred. And Dan sat there in the parking lot with the engine off and one hand resting on its trembling back, saying nothing, because he understood exactly what that kind of shaking felt like from the inside. And he knew that talking never helped it, only time did, only someone staying. He didn't name it right away. Naming it felt like a commitment he wasn't sure he could keep, a man who couldn't keep himself housed taking on the responsibility of another living thing. But by the 3rd week, he'd started calling it partner, without meaning to, the way you'd address someone you'd worked alongside a long time, and the dog had started answering to the tone of it even before it learned the word. The reveal came almost by accident, the way most important things in Dan's life had a habit of arriving. He was running his hand along the dog's ear one evening, checking for ticks out of old field habit, when his thumb caught on something raised and hard just inside the left ear canal, buried under scar tissue that had grown up around it like the body was trying to reject something that had been put there against its will. It was small, rice grain sized, exactly the shape and placement Dan had seen once before, years ago, crouched beside a black Malinois named Diesel at a forward operating base outside Sangin, while a handler from the Army's 341st Training Squadron ran a wand over the dog's head to check its identification chip before they rolled out on a patrol. Dan sat back on his heels in the gravel, staring at the dog, whose name he still didn't know, and felt something shift in his chest like a door unlocking. "You're not a stray," he said quietly. "Are you?" The dog looked back at him, and for the first time since Dan had known it, its tail moved, not a full wag, just 2 slow thumps against the ground, like it recognized something in the tone of his voice even if it didn't understand the words. The next morning, Dan drove 40 minutes to a farm supply store that carried a livestock microchip scanner, paid the $11 for the privilege, and ran the wand along the dog's skull with hands that weren't entirely steady. The little screen lit up with a 16-digit number and a manufacturer code Dan recognized immediately, because he'd seen that exact code stamped on gear crates 100 times overseas. It was a military-issue chip, not a civilian one, registered through a Department of Defense contractor rather than a local vet's office. He called a man he hadn't spoken to in 4 years that same afternoon, sitting on his tailgate with the phone against his ear, and the dog's head resting heavy against H. "Is boat." Cole, said the voice on the other end, gravel rough, familiar in a way that made Dan's throat tight. I'll be damned, you still walking around. Barely, Gunny, Dan said. Listen, I need a favor. Got a dog here with a DOD chip in it. Military working dog, looks like. You still got contacts who can run a number. There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that meant the man on the other end was already reaching for something to write with. Gunnery Sergeant Tom Reyes had spent 19 years as a Marine K-9 handler before he retired to run a small kennel and training operation outside Fort Bragg. And if anyone Dan knew still had a working relationship with the people who kept records on military dogs, it was him. Dan read him the number off the scanner screen. He heard Reyes typing, heard him go quiet, heard the particular kind of silence that told Dan something had come up on the screen that mattered. You sitting down, Reyes said finally. I'm on a tailgate, close enough. That number comes back to a dog named Ranger, service designation R227, trained out of Lackland, deployed twice with a Marine EOD unit, one deployment, Helmand Province, 2017 to 2018. Reyes's voice had gone careful, the way it did when he was about to say something he didn't fully believe himself. Cole, that's the same province, same year you were there. You remember an EOD detection dog on that deployment. Dan sat very still. Somewhere in the back of his memory, a door he'd kept shut for years creaked open on old hinges. A dusty road outside a village whose name he'd made himself forget. A controlled detonation that went wrong when a secondary device he hadn't cleared went off early. The flash and the roar and the sound of a dog screaming that he'd buried so deep he'd convinced himself he'd imagined it. There was a dog, Dan said slowly. Attached to us for maybe 6 weeks. I don't remember his name. I remember he found 3 devices before I ever got close enough to see them. I remember an IED took him out on a road clearance he stopped. His hand, without his permission, had found the dog's head again, resting on the ruined ear where the scar tissue had grown up around a chip that had somehow survived what everything else around it hadn't. I remember they told us he didn't make it. Records say he was listed KIA, Reyes said quietly. Presumed. No confirmed recovery. Happens more than people think. In a hot extraction, dogs get left behind in the chaos, records get closed out based on best available information, and nobody ever goes back to check because there's a war on and there's always another mission. He paused. Sounds like somebody's best available information was wrong. Dan looked down at the dog, at the clouded eye and the ruined ear and the long pale scars raked across its ribs, and understood, all at once and completely, exactly what those scars were from and exactly what had happened to this animal in the years between a bad road, outside a bad village, and a dumpster behind a diner in Millhaven, Ohio. Some of it he would never know. Some of it he didn't need to, because he could read it in the way the dog still flinched at loud engine backfires, the way it wouldn't go near open flame, the way it slept with its back against a wall and one eye always half open. Ranger, Dan said out loud, testing the name. The dog's ears came up. Both of them, even the ruined one, and its tail thumped twice against the gravel, the same 2 thumps as before. Dan realized the sound of recognition, the sound of something inside the dog reaching back across years of hell toward a word it had once belonged to. Ranger, Dan said again, quieter this time, and put his forehead down against the dog's skull, and neither of them moved for a long time. What followed was the slowest, and, in its own strange way, the best 6 weeks of Dan Cole's adult life, though at the time he'd have been too stubborn to say so out loud to anyone. Living out of a truck with a 70-pound dog required adjustments that Dan made without quite noticing he was making them, the way a man rebuilds a habit around a new center of gravity. He started buying dog food before he bought his own groceries, telling himself it was practical, that a working animal needed protein more than he did, though the truth was simpler than that, and he knew it. He started sleeping with the truck's rear hatch cracked for airflow because Ranger did better with a way to see outside. And Dan found, to his own quiet surprise, that he slept better too, that the sound of the dogs breathing beside him in the dark did something to quiet the part of his own mind that used to lie awake replaying the sound of a controlled detonation gone wrong. Mornings became a routine neither of them had agreed to out loud. Dan would wake first, always old habit, always up before the light, and he'd sit on the tailgate with his coffee while Ranger did a slow methodica L circuit of whatever lot they'd parked in overnight, nose down, ears working, checking the perimeter the way he'd once been trained to check a stretch of road for buried danger. It looked, at first, like nervous pacing. Dan came to understand it was something closer to a job the dog had never been told he could stop doing. "You're off duty," Dan told him one morning, watching Ranger complete his third slow lap of the gravel lot, nose skimming the ground with military precision. "Nobody's paying either of us anymore, partner. You can just be a dog." Ranger looked up at him, amber eye steady, and completed the lap anyway. "Yeah," Dan said into his coffee, "I hear you." He understood it because he did the same thing himself, in his own way, the way he still couldn't sit in a restaurant without a clear line of sight to the door, still counted exits in every room he entered, still woke at the smallest sound with his hand, already reaching for a rifle that hadn't been in that spot in 3 years. Watching Ranger circle the lot every morning was like watching his own nervous system walk around on 4 legs, and somewhere in that recognition, something in Dan started to soften that hadn't softened in a long time. There was a night, about 2 weeks in, that Dan would remember clearly for the rest of his life. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was the night he understood what he and the dog actually were to each other. A storm rolled through Millhaven hard and fast. The kind of summer storm that turns the sky green and drops the temperature 15 degrees in 10 minutes. And about 4 minutes into it, a transformer somewhere down the road took a lightning strike and went off with a crack and a flash that lit up the whole lot like daylight. Dan was out of the driver's seat and flat against the side of the truck before his conscious mind had caught up with what his body was doing. Old reflex, old training, the kind that never fully goes away no matter how many years pass. And it took him a full 10 seconds of hard breathing to remember he was in Ohio, not Helmand, and that the sound had been a transformer and not incoming. When he climbed back into the truck, shaking, embarrassed in the particular way a strong man is embarrassed by his own fear, he found Ranger pressed into the far corner of the back seat, flattened low, trembling so hard the whole vehicle seemed to hum with it, his good eye wide and fixed on nothing. Dan didn't say anything right away. He'd learned over 3 weeks that talking too soon didn't help either of them. He climbed into the back instead, folded himself into the cramped space beside the dog, and just sat there, breathing slow and deliberate, the box breathing pattern a combat medic had taught him years ago: 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out, hold 4, not talking, not touching, just being a steady presence in a small space during a bad moment. After a while, he felt Ranger's trembling body ease closer to his, felt the dog's weight settle heavy and warm against his side, and Dan kept breathing his slow 4-count pattern until he realized the dog's breathing had synced to it, until the shaking eased into stillness, until they were both just 2 scarred things sitting quiet in the dark, waiting out a storm that had nothing to do with weather anymore. "I got you," Dan said finally, once it was over, once the thunder had rolled off east and the only sound was rain on the roof. "I got you, partner. Same as you had me back there. I remember now. I remember you found the one on the left before I ever got close enough to see the wire. You did that. You did that for all of us." Ranger's tail thumped twice against the seat. It became their signal, over the following weeks, 2 thumps for recognition, for agreement, for "I hear you." Dan started using it as a kind of question. "Good boy, thump thump. We doing okay today? Thump thump." It was a small, private language built out of almost nothing, and Dan found himself looking forward to it more than he'd looked forward to anything in a long time. There was one more piece of care that mattered more than the rest, and it happened on a Tuesday, about a month into their strange partnership, when Dan noticed Ranger limping worse than usual on his back left leg and pulled him gently onto his side in the shade behind the diner to look. What he found, buried in matted fur along the inside of the thigh, was an old wound that had never fully closed, a puncture long healed over on the surface, but clearly still angry underneath, hot to the touch, weeping slightly at one edge. "Easy," Dan murmured, running his hand along the dog's flank in long, slow strokes while his other hand worked the fur apart to get a better look. I know it's ugly. Just gonna clean it up, that's all, same as anybody'd do for a buddy." He didn't have proper supplies, no clinic, no vet he could afford, so he improvised the way he'd improvised feel. De-care 100 times overseas, using bottled water to flush the wound, a clean strip torn from an old undershirt as gauze, a tube of antiseptic ointment he kept in his glove box for his own scrapes. Ranger held still through the whole thing, tense but trusting, his good eye fixed on Dan's face the entire time, and when it was done and wrapped, Dan sat back and found his own hands were shaking harder than they had in months. Not fear, something else. Something that felt uncomfortably close to grief for every version of this moment he'd lived through with men whose wounds he hadn't been able to fix. "There it is," Dan said quietly once his hands had steadied. "You're gonna be all right. Both of us are gonna be all right." He almost believed it when he said it. It was 3 days after that, on a bright, ordinary Friday morning, that the trouble started, and it started so quietly that Dan almost missed it. He'd taken a short-term job doing maintenance work around the Millhaven County Courthouse, a squat limestone building on the town square that had been standing since 1911 and looked every year of it, replacing a section of rotted trim along the side entrance for cash paid under the table by a facilities manager who didn't ask too many questions about a man living out of a truck. Ranger came with him, because Ranger went everywhere with him now, curled in a patch of shade near the delivery entrance while Dan worked, apparently content to watch the comings and goings of clerks and lawyers and the occasional deputy. It was on the 3rd day of that job that Dan first noticed Ranger's behavior change. The dog had been lying in his usual spot, half asleep in the sun, when a man came through the side entrance carrying a canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Mid-40s, county maintenance uniform, a face Dan half recognized from around the building over the past few days. Someone who came and went with cleaning supplies and boxes of files with a kind of unhurried, unremarkable regularity that made him invisible in the way people who belong somewhere are always invisible. Ranger's head came up off his paws. Not fast, not obvious. Dan almost missed it himself, and he was watching. Just a slow lift of the head, ears forward, nose working, that good amber eye tracking the man across the lot with an intensity Dan hadn't seen since the thunderstorm. Then Ranger did something Dan hadn't seen him do before. He rose, slow and deliberate, walked 3 careful steps toward the man's path and sat. Just sat, dead still, staring at the spot on the ground where the man had paused briefly to shift the duffel bag on his shoulder. And then, once the man had gone inside, Ranger stayed sitting there for a full 10 seconds before finally standing and returning to his shade. Dan set down his hammer. He'd seen that exact behavior before, a long time ago and a long way from here. A trained detection dog locking onto a scent and giving a passive alert. Sit and stare. No bark, no fuss, just absolute stillness at the source. Because that was how they trained EOD dogs to signal, quiet and precise. Because a bark near an unstable device could be the difference between a controlled response and a catastrophe. "You're not doing that for no reason," Dan said quietly, crouching down beside the dog, running a hand along his back, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring. "What do you smell, partner?" Ranger looked at him and didn't wag, didn't relax, just held that same tight, alert posture, eyes fixed on the door the man had gone through. Dan didn't have proof of anything. He had 11 years of training telling him that a working dog didn't sit and stare at nothing, and he had a gut feeling he'd learned a long time ago never to argue with. So he did what he'd have done overseas. He watched, quietly, patiently, without drawing attention to himself, and he started paying closer attention to a maintenance man named. He learned it off a name tag 2 days later, Ellis Doyle. Over the following week, working his repair job around the courthouse, Dan noticed things a man who wasn't looking wouldn't have noticed. Doyle's schedule didn't match a normal maintenance rotation. He came in at odd hours, sometimes well before the building opened, sometimes carrying that same canvas duffel that never seemed to change size no matter what he claimed was in it. He spent an unusual amount of time in and around the basement archive room, where old case files and evidence boxes were stored. And twice, Dan watched him meet briefly in the parking lot with a heavyset man in an expensive coat who didn't look like he belonged anywhere near a county courthouse. The two of them exchanging a few quiet words, and on the second occasion, what looked unmistakably like an envelope. And every single time Doyle came near the building carrying that duffel bag, Ranger alerted, sat, stared, held still, every time. Dan started keeping a small notebook, dates, times, And he observed, the same methodical way he'd have documented anything suspicious in a combat zone, because that discipline had never left him even when everything else had. He didn't go to anyone yet. He didn't have anything solid enough, and the last thing a homeless veteran with a stray dog needed was to walk into a county sheriff's office accusing a courthouse employee of something based on a canine's body language. He'd be laughed out the door, or worse, treated as exactly the kind of unstable drifter the system already assumed he was. So he watched and he waited, and he made one more phone call to Gunny Reyes, who listened to Dan describe the alert behavior in careful, specific detail and went quiet for a long moment before saying, "That's not guesswork you're describing, Cole. That's a trained, passive indication. Whatever that dog's picking up, his training says it's real, and EOD dogs don't false alert on nothing. They cost too much to train sloppy." "So what do I do with that?" Dan asked. "You do what you were trained to do," Reyes said. "You investigate quiet, you confirm before you act, and when you've got something solid, you take it to somebody who can actually do something about it. You don't sit on a live indicator, Dan. You clear it or you report it. Those are the only two options that ever kept anybody alive." The confirmation came 4 days later, and it came from a source Dan hadn't expected. A young court clerk named Priya Anand, who he'd struck up a brief, friendly acquaintance with over his weeks doing repair work. The kind of easy hallway conversation that develops between people who see each other every day without really knowing each other. She found him on his lunch break, sitting on an overturned bucket near the side entrance with Ranger's head resting on his knee, and she looked over her shoulder twice before she sat down beside him, which told Dan immediately that whatever she was about to say, she didn't want overheard. "You've been watching Ellis Doyle," she said, quiet and direct, no preamble. Dan didn't bother denying it. "Your dog's been watching him more than I have." Priya glanced at Ranger, who had lifted his head at the mention and was watching her with the same steady amber attention he gave everything now. "I process case files for the archive room," she said. "Old evidence boxes, closed cases, stuff that's supposed to sit for years before it gets purged. 6 months ago, I started noticing discrepancies, boxes logged as present in the inventory system that weren't actually on the shelves when I went to pull them. Small stuff at first, then bigger. There was a fraud case, closed 3 years ago, involving a defense contractor overbilling the county on a courthouse renovation project, and the entire evidence box just isn't there anymore. Gone. No transfer record, no destruction order, nothing, just gone. And Doyle has access to that room." "Doyle has a key to every room in this building," Priya said. "And I've seen him in the archive room after hours more than once, when there's no reason for maintenance to be down there at 10 at night." She hesitated, and Dan watched her weigh something before she said it. "The judge on that fraud case, 3 years ago, the one who dismissed it for lack of evidence right before the trial date, which never made sense to me because the case looked solid from the file summaries, that was Judge Harlan Voss. Same judge who's presiding over the docket this week. Same judge you've got your hearing in front of on Thursday." Dan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What hearing?" Priya looked at him with something like pity, which he hated, but he let it pass because she clearly didn't mean it unkindly. "The county's been running a sweep on vagrancy and unauthorized overnight parking around town property. Somebody filed a complaint about a truck parked repeatedly near the courthouse and the diner lot. You're on Thursday's docket, Mr. Cole. Voss doesn't usually go easy on those cases, and he's not exactly known for being kind about it." Dan sat with that for a long moment, one hand resting on Ranger's head, feeling the dog's steady breathing under his palm, and understood, with a clarity that settled over him like cold water, that whatever thread he'd started pulling at was about to bring him face to face with the exact man sitting at the center of it, in the one setting where Dan would have the least power and the most to lose. "Why are you telling me this?" Dan asked quietly. "You don't know me, not really." Priya considered the question seriously before she answered it. "Because 6 months ago, I filed an internal concern about the missing files with my supervisor, and it went nowhere. And because I've watched that dog of yours alert on Doyle 3 separate times from my window, and dogs don't lie about things like that, Mr. Cole, even when everybody around them wants to pretend otherwise." She stood, brushing off her slacks. "T. Courtroom 2, be careful what you say to Voss. He doesn't like being told he's wrong, and bring your dog. I have a feeling you're going to want him there. Dan spent the 2 days before the hearing doing the only thing that had ever made sense to him in uncertain circumstances. He prepared, methodically, the way he'd have prepped for a mission with incomplete intelligence. He couldn't prove fraud. He couldn't prove what was in Doyle's duffel bag or what Voss had or hadn't been paid to make disappear 3 years ago. What he could do was document everything he'd observed, dates and times in his notebook, and make sure that if things went sideways in that courtroom, there would be a clear account of what had led him there. He also, quietly, without making a show of it, called Gunny Ray's one more time and asked him to email over Ranger's official service record. The training documentation, the deployment history, the citation Ranger had received, posthumously as far as the record had shown until 3 weeks ago, for the detection work that had saved 4 Marines' lives on that road outside Sangin, Dan included. He didn't know yet if he'd need it. But he'd learned a long time ago that it was better to have documentation you never use than to need it and not have it. Thursday morning came in gray and humid, the kind of overcast summer day that makes everything feel slightly underwater. Dan put on the one collared shirt he owned that didn't have a hole in it, brushed the worst of the road dust off Ranger's coat, and drove the 2 of them to the courthouse with his hands steadier than he expected them to be, given what was riding on the day. Courtroom 2 was smaller than Dan had pictured, wood-paneled and close, maybe 40 seats of worn oak benches, a low railing separating the gallery from the bar, and at the front, elevated on a dais that put him a good 3 feet above everyone else in the room, sat Judge Harlan Voss, a heavy-set man in his 60s with iron-gray hair combed severely back and small. Sharp eyes that swept the room with the particular contempt of a man who had spent decades believing his robe, made him better than everyone standing in front of him. Dan's case was called mid-morning, after 2 other minor matters had been dispatched with brisk, dismissive efficiency. He walked to the defendant's table with Ranger heeling calmly at his left side, exactly the way the dog had clearly once been trained to walk beside a handler, and he felt the whole room's attention shift toward the dog before it ever landed on him. The scars, the clouded eye, the patchy coat, all of it visible under fluorescent light in a way that made Ranger look, to anyone who didn't know his story, like exactly the kind of animal that shouldn't be allowed in a public building. "Mr. Cole," Voss said, reading from the file in front of him without looking up, "you're here on a citation for repeated unauthorized overnight parking on county-adjacent property, and a related complaint regarding an unrestrained animal in a public area." He finally raised his eyes, and they moved over Dan with an assessment that took in the worn boots, the thin frame, the careful stillness of a man who'd learned not to react visibly to provocation. "Do you have anything to say before I rule?" "Your Honor, I'm a disabled veteran currently working through a VA claims dispute that's left me without stable housing," Dan said, keeping his voice level, keeping his hands loose at his sides the way he'd trained himself to stand in front of officers who outranked him and didn't like what he had to say. "I've been parking on that lot with the diner owner's permission. I've kept the area clean. My dog is under voice control at all times and has never shown aggression toward anyone." Voss's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Your dog," he said, glancing down at Ranger with open distaste, taking in the milky eye, the ragged ear, the scars, "looks like it wandered out of a junkyard, Mr. Cole. I've seen strays in better condition. I don't know what impression you're hoping to make bringing a worthless mutt like that into my courtroom, but it isn't working in your favor." The room went very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone senior has said something cruel, and everyone present is deciding whether it's their place to react. Dan felt heat rise up the back of his neck, old and familiar, the same heat he used to feel standing in front of officers who'd never walked point on a single patrol lecturing him about risk tolerance. He kept his face still. He'd had a lot of practice keeping his face still. "That dog, Your Honor," Dan said, quiet and even, "has a Department of Defense Service record showing 2 combat deployments as a military working dog, and a citation for detecting an improvised explosive device that saved 4 Marines' lives on a road in Helmand Province in 2018, mine included. I'd be happy to submit the documentation." Something flickered across Voss's face, not shame, Dan noted, but irritation, the particular irritation of a man who doesn't like being made to look small in front of a room he considers his own. Noted for the record, Voss said, in a tone that made clear he considered the note irrelevant. It doesn't change the fact that you've been in violation of county. He never finished the sentence. Ranger, who had been sitting calm and still beside Dan's chair through the entire exchange, rose to his feet. Not fast. Not with a bark, not with any of the drama a movie would have given the moment. He simply stood, ears forward, nose working, and turned his head toward the side of the courtroom near the jury box, where a narrow service door led back toward the archive stairwell. And he sat, dead center in the aisle, staring at that door with an intensity that made 3 separate people in the gallery instinctively turn to look at what he was looking at. "Your Honor," Dan said, and something in his own voice had changed, gone flat and focused in a way that came from somewhere much older than the last 5 minutes. "That dog is giving a trained explosive detection alert. Right now, at that door." The courtroom didn't erupt so much as it seemed to inhale all at once. A collective sharp breath of 40 people realizing simultaneously that the strange, scarred dog they'd all been quietly pitying or dismissing 30 seconds earlier had just done something none of them fully understood, but every instinct told them to take seriously. Voss's face went through several colors in quick succession. "This is absurd," he started. "I will not have a courtroom disrupted by." "Sir," Dan said, cutting across him with the kind of authority that 11 years of handling live ordnance under fire builds into a man's voice whether he wants it there or not. "With respect, I've watched that dog give this exact alert 3 separate times this week on a maintenance employee named Ellis Doyle, who has unrestricted access to this building and has been observed removing files from the evidence archive without documentation. I am asking you, as a matter of public safety, to clear this room." For a moment, nobody moved. Then a bailiff near the back of the gallery, a young deputy who Dan would later learn had done 2 tours as an Army MP before taking the courthouse job, made the call the room needed someone to make. He crossed to the front, spoke low and urgent to the clerk, and within 90 seconds had raised his voice to the gallery. "Everybody up, calm and orderly, out the main doors now. This isn't a drill, folks, let's move." What happened over the following 20 minutes unfolded with the particular blend of chaos and procedure that Dan recognized from a dozen real-world incidents overseas. People moving faster than they wanted to admit, trying to look composed while their bodies clearly understood the stakes better than their minds did. The courtroom emptied in under 3 minutes, faster than Dan would have guessed a room full of civilians could manage, funneled out through the main doors by the young deputy and 2 more who'd come running at the first radio call. Voss, stripped of his elevated dais and his robe of authority, moved with the rest of them, his face gray, his earlier contempt nowhere in evidence now. Dan stayed. He hadn't been asked to, and nobody had time to argue with him about it. And the truth was that once the room had cleared, the only person in it with any relevant training on what to do next was a homeless veteran with an EOD background, and the dog still sitting rigid and focused at the service door. The county sheriff's department's response team arrived within 11 minutes, fast for a rural county. And Dan understood later that a sharp young 911 dispatcher had heard the words "explosive detection alert" and "veteran EOD tech" in the same sentence, and made the call to escalate immediately rather than wait for confirmation. A state police bomb technician named Sergeant Aldana arrived with the county unit not far behind, and Dan gave her a rapid, precise briefing in the clipped, information-dense cadence of a man reporting to a superior in a live situation. Location, behavior pattern, timeline of prior alerts, the dog's service history. Everything laid out in under 90 seconds, because that was exactly how he'd been trained to hand off a live indicator to an incoming specialist. Aldana looked at Ranger, still holding his position at the door with the stillness of an animal who understood exactly what his job was and had no intention of stopping until someone relieved him of it, and made her decision fast. "We're not moving that door until I get eyes on what's behind it," she said. "Cole, your dog's alert is the most specific piece of intelligence we've got. I want you both nearby, but behind the line, understood? This is my scene now." Dan understood. He'd been the one giving that order to Oz. Our people once, a long time ago, and he respected the chain of command even when every muscle in his body wanted to be the one moving forward. What Aldana's team found working the door and the narrow stairwell beyond it with slow, methodical care, wasn't the catastrophic device the whole building had braced for. It was, in its way, almost worse, because it revealed exactly how long the danger had been sitting there unnoticed. A canvas duffel bag, the same one Dan had watched Ellis Doyle carry through that building a dozen times over the past 2 weeks, had been left wedged behind a stack of old filing boxes at the base of the archive stairwell, positioned close enough to the courtroom's ventilation intake that Aldana would later note, in her official report, that a chemical accelerant device of the kind ultimately found inside it could have caused catastrophic smoke and fire conditions throughout the entire building within minutes of activation. Timed, investigators would later determine to detonate during the afternoon docket, when the courtroom and gallery would have been at their fullest. It wasn't a bomb built to kill through blast force. It was crude, improvised, built by someone without Dan's training, and Dan would say so plainly in his statement. But it was real, and it was live, and it had been sitting 40 feet from where Judge Harlan Voss had been mocking a scarred dog's worth 20 minutes earlier. Ellis Doyle was located and detained less than an hour later, picked up by county deputies at his home 8 miles outside town, and it did not take investigators long, once they started pulling the thread Priya Anand had first noticed 6 months earlier, to understand the full shape of what had been happening. The missing evidence box from the 3-year-old fraud case, the one that had vanished from the archive without documentation, had concerned a defense contractor named Halbrook Municipal Group, which had significantly overbilled the county on a courthouse renovation contract, and when the fraud investigation had gathered momentum, had paid to make the physical evidence disappear, and investigators would allege in the following weeks. Had paid rather more to ensure the presiding judge found a reason to dismiss the case before it ever reached trial. Doyle, deep in gambling debt and given unsupervised access to the building as a maintenance employee, had been the one who made the evidence vanish. And when a new district attorney's office had begun quietly reopening old fraud cases that spring, the same reopening effort that had prompted Priya's original concerns, Doyle and the people paying him had grown desperate enough to consider a much more permanent way of making an inconvenient hearing and an inconvenient judge's testimony disappear altogether. Whether Voss himself had known the full extent of what his old benefactors were now planning would become a separate and much longer legal question, one that would occupy the state attorney general's office for the better part of a year. But what became immediately, undeniably clear to everyone standing in that courthouse parking lot that afternoon was that a scarred, one-eyed dog that a judge had called worthless 20 minutes earlier had just prevented what could have been a mass casualty event in the middle of a public building. The physical part of it, what little there was, happened fast and without any of the drama Dan had spent years quietly bracing for in situations like it. Doyle didn't resist arrest. There was no chase, no confrontation with weapons drawn, nothing that would have made for dramatic footage if anyone had been filming. The only moment that came close to a physical reckoning happened 3 days later, when investigators, following financial records Priya had helped pull together, traced the payment chain back to a Halbrook Municipal Group executive named Carl Ferris. The same heavyset man in the expensive coat Dan had watched meet Doyle in the parking lot, and Dan happened to be present, delivering a follow-up statement at the sheriff's office, when deputies brought Ferris in for questioning, and the man, cornered and desperate, made a run for the side exit through a hallway where Dan and Ranger were sitting on a bench waiting their turn. Dan didn't think about it. 11 years of training doesn't leave room for thinking in a moment like that, only for doing the thing the body already knows how to do. He was up and moving before Ferris made it 3 strides, one hand closing hard on the man's shoulder, spinning him off balance and into the wall with the same controlled, economical force he'd have used clearing a room years earlier. No more force than the situation required, nothing showy, just fast and certain and over in under 4 seconds. Ranger, for his part, did exactly what a trained working dog does when his handler moves fast toward a threat. He was there at Dan's side instantly, planted low and solid, a grow. WL rolling up out of his chest that had nothing tentative in it, and Ferris, staring down at a dog he'd apparently been told about but never seen, went very still and stopped resisting entirely. Good boy, Dan said quietly, once the deputies had Ferris in cuffs and the hallway had gone still again. Ranger's tail thumped twice against the floor, and then he sat, calm as anything, like he hadn't just helped stop a man from running. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of whirlwind for a man who'd spent the last 5 months trying to be as unnoticed as possible. Local news picked up the story first, then a regional outlet, and within 10 days, a national wire piece had run under a headline that made Dan wince every time someone showed it to him, because it flattened everything that had actually happened into something that sounded more like a movie than his life. The county commission, in a public session that Dan attended only because Priya insisted he owed it to himself to be there, formally dismissed the vagrancy citation against him. And the commission chair, a soft-spoken woman named Alvarez, read a short statement into the record that acknowledged, with more grace than Dan expected from local government, that the county had failed a veteran who deserved better than a parking ticket while he waited on a broken system to fix its own mistakes. Judge Harlan Voss did not preside over another case in Millhaven County. He resigned within the month, ahead of a state judicial conduct inquiry into his handling of the original Halbrook fraud case. And while the full truth of what he had or hadn't known would take much longer to sort out in other rooms than the one Dan had stood in, the image that stuck with most people in town, the one that ran under half a dozen headlines and got repeated at the diner counter for months afterward, was simple and needed no embellishment. A judge had mocked a scarred veteran's dog as worthless, and 20 minutes later that same dog had likely saved the man's life along with everyone else's. There was a reward, eventually, a modest one from the county for information leading to the fraud arrests, and a considerably larger unsolicited one from Halbrook Municipal Group's insurers, who settled quickly and quietly once the scope of the scheme became public, keen to be seen doing the right thing by the man who'd stopped a disaster on their former contractor's payroll. Dan used some of it, with a kind of careful, disbelieving practicality, to finally clear the medical debt that had been dragging at him for 2 years, and he used the rest to put a down payment on 11 acres of scrubby, unremarkable land 20 minutes outside Millhaven, with a small farmhouse on it that needed work he was, for the first time in years, actually excited to do himself. But when people asked him afterward, and a lot of people asked, reporters and county officials, and eventually a VA caseworker who'd suddenly become remarkably responsive, once Dan's name started appearing in news coverage the agency clearly wished it had handled better the first time around. What the whole ordeal had actually given him. Dan never talked about the money, and he never talked about the reward, and he mostly deflected the parts about being called some kind of hero. Because that word had never sat right on him, even back when he wore a uniform. What he talked about, when he talked about it at all, was smaller and quieter than any of that. He talked about a porch. By late autumn, Dan had the farmhouse in livable shape. Not finished, not by a long stretch, but livable, with a wood stove that actually drew right and a roof that didn't leak and a wide covered porch facing west, where the fields ran gold and empty toward a tree line that turned every color at once for about 2 weeks each October. Most evenings, once the day's work was done, Dan sat out on that porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and Ranger lay stretched across the boards beside him, head resting on his front paws, that clouded eye turned toward the sunset the way the good one always was, and Dan didn't think about court dates or duffel bags or judges anymore. He thought about very little at all, which was, he'd come to understand, the whole point. Ranger still did his morning perimeter check, every day, without fail, old habits. The kind that don't fully leave an animal any more than they leave a man, but somewhere along the way it had stopped looking like vigilance and started looking, at least to Dan, like something closer to a dog, simply enjoying the shape of his own land. He still gave 2 thumps of his tail for good boy, and for we doing okay today, and more often now, for no particular reason at all. Just because Dan was near and the evening was quiet and there was nothing left for either of them to be afraid of. "We did all right, partner," Dan said one evening in November, snow just starting to spit sideways across the porch light, his voice low and easy in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. "Took us a while to get here, but we did all right." Ranger's tail thumped twice against the boards, and Dan reached down and rested his hand on the ruined ear, on the small hard chip still buried there under years of scar tissue, the last physical proof of everything the dog had survived to get to this porch, this evening, this particular kind of quiet. Neither of them needed it explained. They'd both been carrying the same kind of silence for a long time, and now, finally, they got to sit in it together instead of alone. If this story moved you even a little, take a second and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps stories like Dan and Ranger's find the people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more of these. We've got a lot more veterans and dogs whose stories deserve to be told with the care they earned. Drop a comment and tell us what part hit you hardest, whether it was that courtroom or that porch at the end, because we read every single one. And if you know someone who'd sit with this story, the way Dan sat with that dog in the rain, go ahead and send it their way. Thanks for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.